Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. On this podcast, we're going week to week discussing a few different shows that we've been watching. In today's episode, I'll be breaking down the third episode of the fourth season of Industry on HBO. Of course, we continue to watch The Night Manager, the most recent episode currently available, so make sure you catch up on it if you have been watching that show, or if you're behind on it. This is the fifth episode that we'll be discussing on Wednesday in my conversation with Sona, and just 1 week away from the finale of this mini season. And also we continue to cover the Pitt, so expect that conversation later this week. And also somewhere along the way, either in a separate episode or in one of those, Darren, who's on vacation and can't join me for this conversation right now, will be returning and we'll be having a conversation about the Park Chan-wook film No Other Choice, which unfortunately got no Oscar nominations. And I was predicting a really strong run for this film if it had landed a bunch of nominations, but yet again, Park Chan-wook ignored by the Academy Awards. But a really great film, so do check it out. And if you have, then we'll be having that conversation. It's going to be a spoiler-filled conversation later this week. Before we get into the Industry breakdown, I did want to make a recommendation. Also, of course, on Sunday nights, right after Industry, if you've been watching it, this new Game of Thrones adjacent series, The Night of Seven Kingdoms, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which I've already been praising in the previous episode. And it's exactly what I've been complaining, that these managers of these large IPs have got to, in a way, reset audience expectations, simplify the stories they're telling. Obviously, you can build upon them, but this is the type of show that I was waiting to experience. And I'll correlate it to a huge success that Marvel had last year in the Agatha All Along series that opened much smaller than these other higher profile Marvel series. But by the time we got to the end of it, it had the highest completion rate of any of those Marvel series and has only grown since then. And almost certainly a significantly cheaper production and much lower stakes, but had a vigorous fan reaction and just a big success for Marvel. And here we have again this much lower stakes, still in the canonically within the world. It's a less of an expansion on the source material than House of the Dragon, for example, a very faithful adaptation to these short stories that George R.R. Martin has been publishing over the past decade or so. And he has even more stories in this cycle, which of course will lead to potentially even more seasons of this show. It's already been renewed for a second season. But if you're behind on the show, I do recommend, and I will not be following this week to week, definitely not on the podcast, even if I continue to watch it in this way, because the pilot episode was only 40 minutes long, and this episode, the second episode, only 30 minutes long. And from what I've heard, the rest of the season, only 6 episodes long, by the way, will all be around 30 minutes long. So if you do the math on that, we're talking about a very quick binge, and you may want to save this as a binge. And I'll get into a little bit of the plot here, but in very general terms, this is a lot of fun if you like these type of fantasy stories. There's definitely a meta element to the story that is winking at us, obviously knowing that we have a relationship with this much bigger story that this is just a small part of. But specifically, even in this very episode of the show, in which multiple characters talk about how the stories being told by the characters within the context of the show are simply history, but transformed by narrative. The telling of the story has deformed the facts. And of course, we are experiencing not only that, the very story we're seeing is theoretically just this history, a fictional history, obviously, but this history within the mythology of this universe. So it's very clever, but it's about something. It's about the telling of these stories and how they become the truth as they are continuously retold. But it's also just very low stakes, requires a very low barrier of entry, of course, and so much fun. These two actors, the egg character, this child, has not had, I think, any acting experience before, and shoulder to shoulder, or I should say like hip to shoulder, with this gigantic, also non-professional actor, a former rugby player, Peter Claffey, playing Sir Duncan, or Dunk the Tall. Indeed, very tall. I think he's 6'6". And not only does he tower over everybody in the show, obviously towers along his squire, which is about half his size. But not only are they physically so different, we obviously have someone who has the physical strength that might be required for a knight, but maybe not the wit and savvy. And as we discover over the course of the second episode, this very young, inexperienced, of course, as a person, but very savvy, very clever, and very well educated. And that's an odd name to have, Egg. And why did he shave his hair? And isn't there someone that they're looking for in this very episode? Where could this all be heading? So maybe a little explanation as to where Egg has actually run away from. Of course, if you have very carefully watched the original Game of Thrones or have read these books, you know who Egg is, and I'm pretty sure we're all going to find out next week. So not much of a spoiler. But all this is to say that just these oddly matched characters, perfectly cast, and the friendship they're forming and this symbiotic relationship they have is just very structurally sound for telling this type of story. And there's a real camaraderie between them. Like the casting is truly excellent. This young actor, by the way, is Dexter Soul Ansel. Definitely want to shout him out as well. This is a very tough role to cast and absolutely perfectly cast in this particular regard. There's a lot of comedy here. By the way, I have heard that this show is just Game of Thrones for kids. Given some of the sexual content, I'm not sure that this is for kids. Definitely would not let my daughter watch this, especially when we find out in this particular episode the unique attribute that Sir Arlen Pennytree happened to have. Let's just say he was exceptionally well armed. In this particular episode, we see Duncan really starting to realize what it entails to try to win this tournament when he is going to buy his armor. And he's like, I'm definitely going to pay you back because I intend to win. And the armorer says, sure. And everybody else here is expecting to lose and just cheer you along. And he's really starting to feel out of his depth. And then, of course, like everything in this show, the duality of seeing Egg being very familiar with these type of games, knowing everyone's history. And once again, we'll find out why very soon. And you don't even have to know all of this mythology. Like we have met a Baratheon already. The Targaryens have now arrived. So, of course, if you're very familiar with this universe of the Game of Thrones series up to this point and haven't read the books, if you've read the books, you probably know most of what's going to happen, of course. But even if you have not, a lot of familiar faces and just in the background, just this discovery of what has happened in the meantime. The Targaryens are still in power, but without their dragons, they're a little more commonplace, not as powerful as they once were. So a sense that everything is kind of less heightened than it was just less than a century before, which honestly seems a little fast when you think about this is just me nitpicking, but when you think about just the universe of Game of Thrones, even if dragons haven't been around for 100 years, seems like people have really forgotten very quickly just how terrifying that would be. It seems like, if you correlate them to something like a nuclear bomb, you'd figure the weight of that would have lasted a lot longer. But with that minor nitpick aside, in general, this has been really pleasant couple of episodes. You don't make your head hurt having to look at a family tree or something to figure out what's going on. It gives you a little bit of homework to do if you want to say like, oh, I wonder what was happening with that family in the meantime. Although I'm sure any additional context you need to have will be additionally fleshed out. But primarily just this odd couple buddy series between these two very different people trying to find their way. And right away, like I said, very structurally sound. They're on a journey where they complete each other to a large extent. And they have a lot to teach each other. And just even in just these two episodes, there's obviously some very slapstick comedy. A lot of this giant guy smashing his head into everything he runs into. Those door frames are not expecting someone as tall as he is. But just these magical moments, I think back just on episode 1 where they are sleeping under a tree, how Dunk feels like he is, again, a hedge knight, a knight that sleeps out without a roof over his head. And they see a shooting star. And Egg tells him it's considered good luck to see a shooting star. So all those knights who are sleeping in tents missed that sight of that shooting star. And of course, the luck that comes with it. And Dunk at first laughs it off, but then he does appreciate it. And the show's already full of these very gentle moments. And I think everybody watching the show is cheering for this gentle giant. And apparently a lot of people are watching this show. It got off to a very strong start in the ratings. About 90% of the audience for House of the Dragon. And like I mentioned before, if the ratings stay in that ballpark, this show is significantly less expensive than doing a House of the Dragon. And there are many short stories that have already been published and more to come. And these stories can get more complex and more ambitious. The production values will certainly climb over the years, but for now, a low stake and charming introduction to these characters. And I'm definitely on board with this. Again, if you're watching it, I'd say feel free to check in, but I think this is going to be something much more satisfying to probably binge in one go or maybe check in a couple of times over the season. And that's probably what I'll be doing here, covering it here on the podcast. All right, let's transition over to industry. This third episode of the season, directed by Michelle Saville, not directed by Mickey Down and Conrad Kay, who wrote and directed the first 2 episodes of the show, here in the third episode with one of the staff directors and Joseph Carlton as the single credited writer on the show. So someone from the writing staff, and definitely a different feel in this particular episode. As Darren pointed out in the first couple episodes, a lot of very slow zoom ins, borrowing music from Stanley Kubrick films, obviously invoking or trying to invoke Kubrick's aesthetic. And this third episode is called Habseligkeiten. Sorry about my pronunciation. My German is terrible. We actually do see, of course, very importantly, a German character here who has a very interesting German cultural artifact. As the episode begins, this is a very technical episode, by the way. So another thing, apologies for a few things here, by the way. Apologies for me not being a Game of Thrones expert. And there are definitely podcasts out there where you can get that deeper analysis. Part of the reason I'm not going to do a week-to-week breakdown on a show where I'm severely underqualified. I just want to announce to people who maybe are a little off on that in general. And we're curious to see if this was a good entry point or re-entry point. I would say, even if you're not a House of Dragon fan, you may very well may want to jump back in with this particular series. Likewise, I am not an expert at this industry of corporate finance and even some of these particular financial products, whether it is a short, and especially not in the context of what appears to be the case here in all 4 seasons now of industry, what appears to be a very incestuous relationship of the government, the UK government, and a lot of these corporations. Basically, these political relationships seem to have a much bigger influence on the success of these companies versus here in the United States, where in so many ways, rather than the government propping up these companies and sometimes covering up for them in this show industry, we have a inverted pyramid in some ways, where here we have companies that are so enormously wealthy and basically utilities within the economy that they are above the law in so many ways. And policy it goes the other way around. Either policy is written and excludes them, or they simply make the policy that we all live with. So there's a very particular context here in this episode of industry. So I am just trying, as a layperson, mostly a layperson here, although very curious about this shadowy world of massive amounts of money that move around and have the power to not only change our lives and create huge amounts of wealth, but take political figures and whole nations down sometimes. So it's incredibly high stakes. And the underlying theme of this whole series is that it is populated by gamblers and damaged people, addicts, people who oftentimes have very personal agendas and are putting huge amounts of money and institutions in peril based on their decision-making, and are allowed to do so, facilitated by these people around them that are equally greedy, if not more so. And all of this through these relationships between these characters that we've come to love and hate in equal measure over the course of these 4 seasons. And it's pretty clear even this early in the season that the primary conflict is going to be Yasmin, who's now married in to this aristocratic family, now betting on this new bank, basically tender, who has made its money facilitating transactions for sex work and for gambling, and supposedly pivoting into a more legitimate business. And Harper trying to prove herself, looking for a huge short, and as is called out multiple times in this very episode, wanting to be a contrarian and finding that this bank, which is seen as a potential blue chip, safe investment, something that the powers that be in England want to succeed as proof that the UK can still build one of these giant companies. And Harper, at this moment, she's right, by the way, but at this moment, just willing it to be the case. And of course, the question underlying all of this, why would she do this to Yasmin? She's using that friendship as one vector for looking for this short, something she has done before in a different context, And Harper, of course, continues to be one of, if not the most fascinating character on the show, someone who seems to truly not know themselves, not sure why she has this obsession. She's just saying, hey, I'm just looking for a short. It's not personal, when in reality, the opportunity presented itself to you. You're only looking in that direction because of this friendship you have. And your goal is not to make money on the positive side of that bet, but on the negative side of that bet, and willing it to be true if it's not already the case. And what would drive someone in such a negative way? So as the episode kicks off at the very beginning, very fast talking, this is classic industry in this particular moment. Eric is trying to find investors. Harper is talking to this journalist again, trying to milk him for additional details on this potential misrepresentation of Tender's business practices. And he's just like, look, I'm not going to give you anything. You're not giving me anything I don't already know, but leaves a couple of breadcrumbs for her, I should say, and kicks off a investigation in this particular episode that may very well be the first cracks in this wall. Meanwhile, Yasmin and Henry have rekindled things, of course, and she's getting very frisky in the office. And he's like, I have to be more professional here, when they're interrupted by Haley, which of course foreshadows things to come. Henry is about to meet with Jennifer Bevan, who is in line to be the next prime minister, after a really ugly altercation between them last week. And Yasmin suggests that he play into the whole, I'm trying to get better. I apologize. I've had mental health struggles. Really, this apology leaning on the possible liberal sensibilities of this particular audience. Not unlike what Kanye West did today in the Wall Street Journal. Did he watch Industry last night? Is that what happened? I'm curious, actually, if that is not necessarily what kicked this, his op-ed he purchased today. And she's really building up Henry here. I think she obviously does have some affection for him. There's more going on here, though. She's not only being a little more Machiavellian here, specifically when we get to that scene. We're going to get to it, everybody. But that scene, what does this really mean for their relationship with each other and what she has in mind for him? Or maybe some animosity that she still feels. Or maybe, there's so many maybes here, but maybe it also is what she thinks he might need to keep him in line. She's always played this dominatrix type character with these men that she's in a sexual relationship with. So curious to see how this sets things up for the future. He tells her that he'd be dead without her. Possibly true, by the way. The meeting with Bevan goes pretty well, and her brother also had problems, mental health issues in the past, so this cover story works pretty well, maybe even ingratiates him with her a little bit. She also politically doesn't want to feel like this is apparently strange that this is suddenly feels in the context of the show that Tender is suddenly considered a sure thing and a huge success waiting to happen when it seemed pretty sketchy just a couple episodes ago, but maybe more time has passed on the show than I'm actually aware of. But there definitely is this desire to not feel like the liberal government is not allowing business opportunity in England. Eric and Harper, by the way, are meeting with potential investors. These are mostly rich individuals who have a taste for shorting, and Eric is positioning them as just a 100% short type investment firm. And when some of the attendees there push back and say, well, what kind of shorts are you seeing here? Harper just lets fly that we're looking at Tender. Turns out later on, she tells Eric that she was just taking a flyer because she felt like she was losing the audience. So now she really needs to make this thing happen. And again, I have to think that there's some calculation in the back of her mind that she's thinking, well, I got an inside lead with Yasmin. Henry's not 100%. And even though there's some definite shadiness there at Tender, it's nothing she's confirmed yet. So she needs to believe this and maybe make it happen. Once she kind of gets the attention of the crowd, Harper takes the bull by the horns here and much more confidently talks about how her innate talent is to find dead men walking. And by the way, she has in the past been correct. Eric, great face acting here, by the way. Eric is very uncomfortable with this turn of events, but he plays along and the audience seems interested. If you love to short and all the headlines are touting this hugely successful next company, a short on a stock that's skyrocketing could make you a lot of money. Tender's looking for money as well, and they need to merge with this German bank. And Henry thinks the best way to do this is to go and have some FaceTime with this family that still has an interest in this giant German bank. We jump back again to Eric and Harper. Eric has a really for anybody who follows this type of thing, Eric has a really interesting analog and something very telling about the economic world these people live in. Harper's basically going on her gut instinct. And what Eric reminds her is Bill Ackman, who made a $1 billion short on Herbalife. For those folks out there who don't know about Herbalife, it basically is a pyramid scheme. This is nutritional supplements that you can only sell or buy, I should say, through these sellers, and sellers sell to other sellers, and then you get a percentage of what people sell beneath you, and then you recruit additional sellers. And most of these Herbalife supplements are sold to the people who are actually within this network. For some of your older listeners, you may remember Amway. My parents sold Amway years and years ago. They bought into that whole thing. You're going to get rich doing this. And of course, all we did was buy Amway products for our household goods. And we never made any significant money off of it. And that's pretty much how Herbalife functions. And Ackman would go on these calls every single year and make the case to the owners of the stock that this is simply a pyramid scheme. And it certainly is. And it operates like a pyramid scheme. It looks like a pyramid scheme, but it's all about the narrative. If people are vested in believing this stock is going to go up, then that is the narrative, and people will continue to invest in the company and not sell their stocks. And Ackman eventually had to bail on his short and lose almost the full amount. Of course, he can afford to lose $1 billion, but not many of us can. And definitely not. I mean, Eric is basically putting up his $10 million here to fund this whole entire scheme. And if things go belly up, he's the first to lose everything. So being right is not enough. You need a good story. And Harper, with just a few facts and one article that's going to be published at some point in the future, it's not enough information to sell the world at large, the investment world at large, and the UK government itself that this venture is going to fail and should be shorted. Back at Tender, the story is broken, that it's questionable that Tender has actually stopped processing these illicit transactions. The implication, of course, that they're being willfully blind to money laundering that's happening within the Tender platform. They don't take this too seriously. Oh, these are spurious allegations, yada, yada. And of course, this is all as they are preparing to fly out to Germany. Oh, importantly here, Haley does mention to Yasmin about the near hookup with that journalist and the very person who they've seen this pre-publication article accusing Tender of still being in the same business as before. This interaction gets awkward towards the end. There's a flirtatious energy between the two of them. And then she undermines Yasmin a little bit when Yasmin says, hey, you know, when we arrive in Vienna, just feel free to enjoy yourself. By the way, I misspoke that they were flying to Germany. I guess they're flying into Austria, although this family is German. Of course, with this history with the Nazi party. Spoiler for that part of the episode. And I don't know if that adds anything extra to the possible translation here or meaning of the title. Not the Nazi part, but the Austrian part. But back to the last interactions there, I do wonder if there's like this little bit of a undermining of Yasmin and then that flirtation. And then Yasmin gets from friendly to irritated by her slightly, or at least undermined. And then who's really pulling the strings? I think she's making a point later to both Henry and Haley. Back again. Maybe this is, now that I'm recapping the episode here, maybe this back and forth was not the best way to structure this whole thing. Although it moved pretty well, I have to say. Eric's daughter has visited him. Harper arrives. Some pretty awkward interactions. He seems to give her some money and tell your mom you had a good time. And she's like, I did. I guess she did. The dynamic here developing between Eric and Harper is very interesting because he now repeatedly, or I should say Harper repeatedly has mentioned that she's uncomfortable with them being in this hotel that it's like a large hotel room that they've rented out, I think. And they're using it as their meeting room and their working room. And Eric is sleeping there also. I think that's what's happening. Not ideal, of course. They probably can't afford to rent multiple locations. I think we do see a Bloomberg console being installed in this hotel space. Oh, but importantly, Eric talking about his daughter who has a sister, a twin sister, no less, and that has all these insecurities that have been compounded by having a twin who is better at her, more social than her, better athletically. And again, he is looking for some camaraderie. And Harper, again, gives him nothing. He's like, does not want personal interaction. She just wants to talk business. Even when he goes, do you have siblings? questioning, but also a little irritated that she's so callous. And she immediately, talking business again, she's spoken to Kenny. And by the end of the episode, it looks like Kenny is in the fold. Eric feels uncomfortable about this because he was obviously a total jerk getting Kenny fired because he was having a bad day last season. But everybody stabs everybody in the back in this line of work, apparently. And Kenny doesn't seem to have issues with it, at least not yet. We'll see how that all plays out as the series continues. The gang is getting all back together. Speaking of the gang coming together, of course, Sweet Pea shows up. She's amused by the setup there at the hotel. She's done some very good investigation, and it continues over the course of the episode. And Harper's like, you really need to come work for us. And just after making this offer to Sweet Pea, this is when Rishi shows up, who is the person who outed her and her OnlyFans, or I guess it was an account on this Siren app, this fictional Siren app. And she's like, why are you here? You're a murderer. And he's like, I'm not a murderer. He's a lot of things, but we know this actually. He's not a murderer. Still very curious to know how that case shook out, especially if it was reported that he might have murdered his wife, which, by the way, not a far-fetched theory, given what we saw. I still want to have that explained. Rishi, shockingly humble in these first episodes, but I can't imagine that we're not going to see. I wouldn't be surprised at all if I'm going to theorize at this early in the season that it might look like this short is going to come together and Rishi is going to fall off the wagon, go back to his hardcore gambling ways, not only with the drug taking, but with some of the terrible decision making he made. But at this moment, so much the opposite of what we've seen from him in the past. But maybe he's truly reformed. Maybe with a baby daughter still out there and needing to rehabilitate himself to reunite with her, he may be trying to rebuild his life. Still not beyond stealing people's emails and breaking into their phones, though. Sweet Pea has an ultimatum for Harper that she needs to abandon Rishi or they'll never speak again. I have a feeling that Harper is going to try to play. She needs both of these assets. I have a feeling that this is going to be contentious at some point in the future. Whitney and Haley and Henry and Yasmin all arrive in Austria. They meet Ferdinand, who still appears to live with his mother, Johanna, who's very young looking, by the way, giving the age of her son. Johanna's a princess, so it speaks to once again, these very strange European relationships between the state and this formal royalty and their still ownership of some of these banks. Of course, they're mostly figurehead, as he points out that this is now a capitalist economy. And this is all just a formality because, hey, if you can buy the company, if you can buy the stock, this is all just presentational to come and make this a meeting. But of course, they want it to go as smoothly as possible. Ferdinand has no love for the new neoliberal structure of modern Europe and turns out to have an affinity for fascism. That's when things were running better. By the way, a lot of people in Europe do feel like that now, and you see it in these disturbing results of these elections every single cycle. Johanna shows Yasmin to her favorite room, the room where she put Yasmin and Henry. And here's where the title comes in. She says it's full of their Habseligkeiten, terrible pronunciation there once again, sorry, which are the possessions that are closest to their souls. So the mom here seems to very much want this deal to go through and is being a very gracious host. The son, not so much, maybe because he feels like this is a decision that's not even in his hands at all, or maybe it is his fascist leanings. The idea that this bank that has been around, partially due to its relationship with the Nazi party of the past, is now being acquired by a British company and no less an online bank that primarily facilitates illicit transactions. Ferdinand's main argument circles around the fact that dictatorships are better than democracies. Just look at these going back to my point earlier on, these giantly successful US companies, which operate basically like dictatorships. He also touches on this hot button topic that, of course, we've experienced many times in the past decade or so, but the idea that a lot of these large tech companies have used their users' personal information for targeted marketing or for profiling, and in some cases, intentionally, in some cases, have just leaked information due to hacks. So a legitimately sore point when you're talking about a company that's positioning itself as a tech company. Whitney starts getting sick of this and says, look, you're going to get compensated for this. This is about money. And he says, sure. Ferdinand says, sure, that's always about money. and calls him Mr. Halberstram, of course, a Jewish surname. So really not hiding any of this ugly history. He's talking about the history of the bank. He's talking about the history of Austria, and we have to respect our history. A lot of times that's coded language. Whitney, Henry, and Yasmin meet after this confrontation. Henry and Whitney want to get out of there and see him straight up as a fascist and feel like this is going nowhere. But of course, Yasmin has had this warm connection with the mom, and she insists she's going to stay behind. Before they fly out in the morning, of course, they do have an eventful night ahead. Meanwhile, back to Eric and Harper. Eric is encouraging Harper to get out of here. The work will be here even when you come back. Go have fun tonight. Weren't you supposed to go on a date? What are you doing? Harper does eventually go out and meet up with Kwabena, her former coworker, and a really interesting interaction here where she is pushing him. They can't take things too seriously. Part of this is, I think, something's eating away at her. She wants to go back to investigating. She knows she has some potential lead here. Something's gnawing at her. But also, is she afraid of getting too close to him? She's irritated that he made her wait for this date. She tells him that she's had sex with somebody else. She asks, aren't you doing that too? He's like, no, I'm not. She seems offended, jealous, odd about this. Then she softens up. What is happening here? She's like, but you do like me, right? And he's like, of course I do, although you make it really hard. And he just flippantly, but I don't think insultingly, says, hey, try separating church and state every once in a while. It's easy. And she, great performance here, by the way, just the way her face changes from, she just smiled and been like, hey, be on time next time. She'd kind of forgiven the rough start to this conversation, this date, which lasts like 2 minutes. And she's like, I'm getting out of here. And I was going to offer you a job. And she like scoffs at this. And he's like, really? He's excited there for a moment. Oh, wait, a job? But that's it. She says, maybe this relationship was better via email. And as she walks out the door, storms out of the restaurant. He has a hilarious line of dialogue. What prompted this enormous sense of humor failure? I love that, the idea of a sense of humor failure, which Harper does indeed have maybe no sense of humor. I'm trying to imagine the last time that she was having fun without an agenda. And I do remember at the beginning of season 3, I believe it was, when they're all living in that house that Rob has purchased that has all this repairs need to be done. And seeing her arrive after work, after the intensity of seeing her on the trading floor, Freudian slip there, calling it betting, that she did seem to just walk in and casually drop her jacket or keys. And even then, by the end of that season, the interactions in that house became much more calculated. And there's that really ugly interaction she had with Yasmin, of course. And it really did feel like they were no longer those young green traders that could, and this is specifically for Harper, of course, that she could separate those two aspects of her life, the out-of-work version of herself and the at-work version of herself. So, of course, he has hit a raw nerve. Eric literally telling her almost identically the same thing just before she left the office. When she arrives back, Eric's in his robe. I thought you were going on a date tonight. And this begins a really interesting scene because both of these characters, first of all, the show is just really on the mark whenever we have Eric and Harper together. And she is correct in most of her analysis here, but so is he. First of all, very interesting. We're seeing him in this robe. It's this she's explicitly saying in this moment that this is like an untenable situation. She accuses him of cosplaying not only his familial relationship with his daughter and trying to create some kind of familial connection with Harper, asking her for advice on buying presents for his daughter, that is. But also just the layout of this whole thing, this shared space, this office, is this all a joke to him? Is this just him fighting against his retirement? She wants him to know that this is consequential to her. And then he accuses her of being triggered, and she gets very outraged by this. First of all, doesn't even buy into this phraseology, of course, more popular with her generation than his. So again, she feels like he is trying to play act some role. But he is correct that she is triggered, obviously. We discover here, I think for the very first time, that she's a twin. So of course being triggered by seeing this twin, and in Eric's own estimation, the twin that feels like the lesser than, the one that was not the favorite child. Now, as far as I know, we only know about Harper's brother, who she thought was dead. Part of the reason that she did not complete her degree. Eventually she tracked him down in Berlin. He had been an athlete, ran away from, basically fear of success, or at least expectations of success. and her mother, who seemed to be very domineering from the little bit we know, and we've heard this voicemail. We know she does not want to have communication with her, and presumptively a very domineering figure in her life. So he is absolutely correct. She's hiding this from him, does not want to talk about her personal life. It's just business, does not want to have the discomfort of the personal intervening. I think an extension of what happened in the previous scene where she doesn't know, is she just interested in this colleague as just someone to have as an F buddy? Or is she starting to have feelings for him? And honestly, not knowing what she wanted that conversation to be, but knowing that it was not that. She does go off a little bit on this whole concept of being triggered and how this definition that we need to embrace our trauma because it makes us stronger, it makes us, we rise above. And in a way, maybe more than she intended to, confesses her own limitations here, that she is so focused on work to run away from this because she says trauma does not make you stronger. Trauma is your trauma. It messes you up. But she's not trying to use work to deal with her trauma. She wants to be right and she wants to be good at what she does. And all those things are true. And yet it's obvious that she uses her work as a way to avoid dealing with the rest of her life. And she even says, this is life and death to me. Eric does say, you sound a little triggered there, like an understatement there at the end. Very funny. But most importantly, even though he's been sitting around in his robe and in her eyes, just lounging around, telling her to take some time off and him doing the same, he's actually been going through these boxes and boxes of transactions and has noticed something interesting. Harper earlier in the episode had tried to call all these different helplines and always got redirected to the same call center and was just on hold and no one was answering. But it turns out that not only is there a call center to this Dublin call center, but more importantly, he's noticed every once in a while, there is a care of with an actual physical address. And this, of course, turns into a big clue that is the next stepping stone in this investigation of Tender. But of course we discover that Harper is a twin, left unexplored at this moment, but certainly part of the trigger, this very episode, seeing this daughter trying to build this relationship with this absentee father who's overinvested in his work. And maybe all of this has echoes to the way she grew up. Okay, back to our friends in Austria. And we've arrived at that scene, everybody. Yasmin invites Haley into the marital suite. Henry walks out in just a towel. Kit Harington, by the way, has been doing all of his push-ups and kept the beard, by the way. Is he still waiting, still hoping that that promised Jon Snow sequel series gets made? He's not far off from being ready for it. I guess he'll just bide his time on industry until that day comes. And Yasmin has apparently picked up on some sexual tension, not only reading that Haley has something for her husband, but that he's been looking at Haley too, which leads to the sex scene between them where she instructs them to basically perform for her. And again, this is where industry is most interesting for me. If this was just shock value, it would be soap opera at some point. But there is some psychology. These characters are deeper, more interestingly written, I should say. And it does make me wonder, what is the psychology here of Yasmin with this troubled relationship with her father in the past and feeling like she was always seen as just a pretty face, just a figurehead for the family, just somebody to snap a photo of and put in the tabloids. But she has a real power and she's also trying to prove something. And it's interesting to see, talking about parallels here, we see this paralleling, or I should say this pairing of Eric trying to establish more of a paternal figure, needing to be more of a paternal figure, wanting to focus on work, but yet still having that aspect of himself has not worked successfully with his family, but maybe trying to instill that in Harper. And of course, as we mentioned before, Darren and I in a previous conversation, that also they felt like they were others coming into this banking industry, which was mostly white and male, especially when Eric was younger and always being the other person in the room and having something to prove and seeing that in Harper, that there's that drive there as well. So we see them and their dynamic. And with Yasmin and Harper as well, we see that there's this parallel dynamic in wanting to prove themselves, coming from very, very different social backgrounds, but this trauma within their family unit and needing to define themselves and prove themselves. So the psychology of this sexual presentation is interesting because, of course, she's the audience for this performance, which gives her this power. But then at times you look at her face and you do wonder how much of this is she truly enjoying, how much of it is a kind of performance. And in a way, is it a way for her to not only present some power in this situation where she's been relatively powerless and any authority has been questioned multiple times in this very episode, once by Haley, but also when she's in the room and the question is like, why is she here, right? And Henry has her back, but she still feels like I'm just the other person in a room. So it's a way where she can, behind closed doors at least, have this power. But I also think there's an element of this where she is maybe giving Henry what he needs. By the end of the episode, of course, he asks, who have I married? Once they've finished, we have one of the most shocking scenes in history of industry. The slurp heard around the world, or at least in the fandom of this show. Maybe the less said, the better on this, but the mind reels in this moment. And the inference here as well. Oh, and then when she burps up later on after breakfast, oh my. Not sure I want to smell her breath this morning. But raw oysters for breakfast? Not sure that would be my choice. Yasmin, of course, has stayed behind where the rest of the group left to ingratiate herself further with Johanna. They take the dogs out for a walk, and during the conversation, Johanna mentions that her son just wants to feel important. She knows that the name is just symbolic. They don't really have any real power anymore. And Yasmin comes up with an idea to say, hey, I can have his thoughts published in one of the big newspapers. She has some pull. And Johanna thinks that's great. It'll make him feel good and it'll help smooth this whole relationship. So a successful final step in this negotiation. And before she leaves back to London, she goes for a walk around the palace and notices a painting by Adolf Hitler. So any idea that this family has a history with the Nazi Party clearly represented here. In parallel, Charlie Heaton's fintech reporter has had most of his story redacted. Of course, the pre-publication went to tender. We saw them reading it the day before. The chief editor, is wary of being too aggressive in these accusations without an actual insider. He decides to print it anyway. At least it's a start. He apparently does have an insider, someone who's not willing to go on the record yet. And of course, in parallel to this, we actually have Sweet Pea and Harper tracking down this Dublin address, which is just a residential neighborhood. Turns out there's just an admin in his home receiving mail, and without any understanding of what he's actually doing, shows just his tedious administrative work he does every single day, which apparently entails bucketizing all of these different transactions. So if something's under $5, it goes into one bucket. If something between like 5 and 10 goes into another bucket. So what they're doing is they are mixing together any transactions based on their price point. And then conveniently, if it's $15 and there's a flower shop purchase for $15, then everything under that category goes into flower shop purchases. Although these are actually small transactions for gambling and porn transactions. So they are hiding their business as usual within this anonymizing by bucket size. And they're on a high, understanding that they have some real tangible proof here and that this short might actually have some life to it. Sweet Pea especially very excited here. Harper says, you have to come work for me. And Sweet Pea says, I will. I've seen you quit everything. I want you to follow through on this. And we know that Harper's not good under pressure. So very curious to see how this will all play out. As we get to the end of the episode, a very interesting confrontation here between these government figureheads and the tender decision makers. Of course, touching on real world politics, this idea that after Brexit, the UK wants to play nice again with the EU and trying to pitch not only tender as this merging with a German bank or Austrian bank, I should say, as a step in the right direction to reintegrating with Europe, but also that Labour, which popularly has this anti-corporate stance, but of course wanting to grow the European, the UK economy, and this fantasy of this client-friendly open banking platform that Tender pitches itself to become the biggest online banking platform in the world. And it could all be owned by the UK. And at first, these Labour representatives seem to be pushing back only for the current Prime Minister's representative to come in and say, we're on board with this deal, actually. And we just want some wording in here that the Prime Minister is all on board with this vision of making this banking platform owned by basically a UK technology. Interestingly, because the story has already come out in the newspapers at this point, so for the government to be gung-ho about this just as this bad news may be breaking, And also that Henry, maybe because of what happened the night before, is very distracted here. So I do wonder where his head's at this moment. They don't see much threat at this point, especially the way the story's actually been published. But Henry's annoyed that this op-ed was published by the Austrian banker. He thinks it sets a dangerous precedent. She sees this as people's skills, like soft peddling, and it's somewhat tied to them, but only through Henry's relationship with his uncle, not directly tied to Tender. But of course, what's really irking him here, again, was the night before. He feels what she did with Haley was inappropriate. I mean, with a coworker, no less. I mean, I do think it's inappropriate. And she excuses it. But again, she's making it sound like, well, you wanted her. I just was bold enough to give you what you wanted. But I do think that there is more here going on. Yasmin, again, wanting to dominate from behind the scenes. Who did I marry? Darling, shouldn't you know that? Indeed. And as we get to the end of the episode, the Avengers have finally united. Eric actually wants to increase the amount of sharing with Harper. She is not in favor of that, even though he tells her that he has put in his own $10 million to back this play, but warns her again that this evidence needs more. Even if it bears some fruit, you need to have the groundswell of the stockholders to actually turn on the company for the short to pay off. Sweet Pea arrives as well. Kwabena is here, despite the fact that she rescinded the job offer, apparently changed her mind, probably via email. And Kenny, of course, who was fired from his last position, but has been at Deutsche Bank, so landed somewhat on his feet. Eric feels bad about the way he treated him, but Kenny seems to be like, it comes with the territory. I guess everybody's so cutthroat. You just get used to it at some point in this line of business. And the elevator doors close. Enya plays on the soundtrack. And our team is ready to try to pull off this short, but there's a long way to go. They need to gather evidence. They need to work with that journalist to get that evidence out there. And they need public sentiment to turn the other way. And behind closed doors, now, the Labour Party and the Prime Minister are vested in making this thing look good. So the exact thing that frustrates Harper when she's right, and she wants everyone to know that she's right, and that she might be right, but just like that Herbalife short, it may be all for naught. And that is the stakes for the rest of the season. Not even to mention the interpersonal stuff that's going to happen when Yasmin finds out that Harper is trying to short the company that she's so vested in now, after just having rescued her marriage and potentially Henry himself from suicide. So the stakes could not be higher. Will Eric lose everything? Will Harper again fall flat on her face, even though she's right? Will Yasmin lose everything? Will Henry even survive the season? All remains to be seen. All right, everybody. So that's the episode. Check in later this week. Expect a couple more episodes. At some point, having that conversation with Darren. Plus, of course, discussing The Night Manager, just one more episode before the wrap-up of the season. And more of The Pitt. Oh, and more Drops of God. Briefly, not the type of show that needs a very deep dive. But do keep checking that out. Shrinking's coming back. Maybe Son and I will check in with that show as well. A lot of stuff to watch, and we'll be discussing all of it here on the podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.